I'm Jamie Hubbard. I think I know most of you all by now. I teach Buddhist studies here at Smith College. And this semester we're having a whole lot of fun with this series on insight meditation, its Burmese origins, and we're going to move out a little bit after this talk into some of its more contemporary, or it is contemporary, modern developments. And I always have issues with all these things that I have to deal with, and I never remember them. So if you're not on our mailing list, and you would like to be on our mailing list, I don't know how you couldn't be by now, since I think I've seen most of you several times. That's how we mostly do our advertising on the things that we have coming up. Also, we have a Facebook page. Let's maybe just go Facebook and Google Smith College Buddhist Studies. You'll come to a whole lot of things, including shortly the video of the talks that we're doing in this series. There's also videos of past talks and past series that we run. And so if you're interested, that stuff is on our website. But on Facebook, we put out all of this kind of stuff that we do, and so that's a good way to do it. This is our third speaker. As many of you know, our first two speakers, David McMahon and Eric Brown, and today is Ingrid Jordt, who I'll introduce in a moment. On November 13th, we have Willoughby Britton, a neuroscientist out at Brown University, who does very interesting and somewhat contrary sorts of work with some of her work looking at some of the difficulties that come out of people who meditate. You know, it's not always making everybody all happy and wonderful. But in that case, that's that. And then finally, we wrap up this series on December 4th with Jake Davis, who I believe is also now out at Brown. And he does ethics and applied meditation kinds of studies. He comes out of a philosophy department. So by all means, please come to those. And then, we don't only do mindfulness here at Smith, as you know, since I'm pretty scatterminded. Next week on Tuesday, we have Reverend Patty Nakai, who's giving a talk on nirvana in everyday life, the Shin Buddhist path. Some of you might not know, Shin Buddhism is probably the largest form of Buddhism in the United States because it's the Buddhism of the Japanese American immigrant community. But it hasn't traveled too terribly well out into the Western convert community. But it's a very interesting and a very important kind of path. My advisor when I was a graduate student said, Jamie, you might be interested in the Tibetan thing, or you might be interested in the Chinese stuff, but in the end, when you get old, everybody becomes a Shin Buddhist. And I get it. So I highly recommend this because it's a lot of fun, and it's a neat thing. That's next week on Tuesday, right here, where we are. I don't know what else I'm forgetting, but let me introduce our speaker. I'm very happy. We've been having fun kind of getting to know each other. She's traveled very interestingly to get here. She grew up around the world in more places than I can even count, and did not actually come to the United States until I think she was 14 years old. And Ingrid Jordt then went on and went. She did her BA at Berkeley, and then her PhD at Harvard University. And the things that she was doing when I was, reading about her long ago when I was trying to put this series together, really kind of fascinated me in many ways. She comes to what she's doing here from guerrilla studies. From guerrilla studies, right? She worked, you probably have heard of that very famous gorilla, Coco. Well, Coco, there was another one named Michael. And so she was teaching sign language to gorillas, I guess at Berkeley, right? And
Stanford was a breakup.
It was a breakup, okay. And from her interest in teaching sign language to gorillas, she came to be interested in how some of those issues, how coherent thought, for example, is dependent on language. This led her to take an interest in Vipassana meditation. And I mean, for me, I find this extremely interesting because usually
most of the folks I deal with come to think of meditation as something that you should empty your mind of thoughts, and you should not be involved in a lot of language thinking. But so she took up the practice of vipassana, and she didn't just take up the practice of insight and the neurocognitive dimensions of insight meditation. She actually went to Burma. She's been spending time in Burma since the early 80s, I believe, right? And she traveled there and she ordained as a nun at one of the most important meditation centers. I imagine it will come up today in the talk, at least the meditation center, if not your experience as a nun. Obviously, she's not a nun now, I'm thinking. But so she spent a lot of time doing that, and as she was doing this, her interest in this mass meditation movement began to develop. And as you know, the title of this whole series is Mindfulness, Burmese Roots, and Massachusetts Branches, because we want to move into some of the importance and widespread practice of insight meditation here and mindfulness-based stress reduction that came out of UMass Worcester and all of those kinds of things. And so I stole my title from the title of her book, which, if I can get it up, it's very interesting these days. I don't have, real books anymore. Everything's electronic. So this is her book, Burma's Mass Lay Meditation Movement, Buddhism and the Cultural Construction of Power. And so this is very fascinating to me because, as I said, most of us here, I think in the West, have an understanding of mindfulness that's very interior and very personal and very individual and centered on some kind of an experience that is timeless and not connected with social and cultural phenomena. And so her work, though, has shown very clearly and very interestingly and very powerfully, I think, in my opinion, the way in which those kinds of things, that particular movement, the mass meditation movement in Burma, in fact was very closely related to social and particularly political things. The generals, the generals. So she comes to us from all of that different kind of background. Most fun for me is that she actually has been teaching at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, since 2002 or so. And I'm a Milwaukee boy. That's where I was raised all of my life. And I did my graduate work in Buddhist studies at the sister institution, the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So coming to us from all of those different kinds of places, including Milwaukee, over there by Lake Superior, the submarine races and all that kind of fun stuff, and Harley Davidson's, I don't know what I asked her to leave her Harley at home, and she said, okay.
I brought my jacket.
But yeah, she did bring the jacket. Do you seriously have a Harley? Okay, just checking. You never know. They're pretty popular there. So from all of those different places, I'm very, very pleased and very excited to welcome Ingrid Jordt to our series and our talk, and to Smith College and to all of my colleagues and friends.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Jamie, for inviting me. I have to. So first of all, I'm going to enter this talk. Actually, I'm not sure what I'm going to be talking about. I have some slides. I hope they're going to connect with what I'm going to say, but we'll see. It's one of those things where I think a talk like this needs to be very context-bound. So I have to feel what you are all about. So one thing, I'm going to be entering this conversation from three different sort of perspectives. One is as an anthropologist, as a former nun or tilashin, and also in terms of what Jamie already foreshadowed, what first got me interested in this. Because I think that the questions that we ask are there with us, that we're asking all through our lives, and somehow there are meaningful ways to engage these questions when we can't actually attack the subject head on. Now, why do I say we can't attack it head on? It's because it's so difficult to take something interior like meditation and say, we're going to study it, I'm going to represent it, I'm going to experience it. How do we undertake that project? So I find that always we're putting on one hat or another according to the audience that we're standing in front of. And tonight I'm going to try and make it all messy and move between all these perspectives. So we'll see how that goes. But let me just start out by asking, how many people here are meditators? Let me ask that again. How many people are not meditators? Okay, but now I get a good sense. How many people are Buddhist scholars, Buddhologists? Okay, and how many people are just interested in Buddhism? Oh, well, okay, all right, now I figure out what we're doing. Okay, then we'll skip over quickly what was the first entry into this discussion. The title that I used, which when Jamie asked me, you saw by the title of my book, which I can never remember what the title was because it's so long. If you say enough, it can include everything. So this talk is once again so long, one of those things where you kind of give yourself a lot of rope to hang yourself. But the point here is it's actually a joke that's taken off of a book in Anthropology written by Marshall Solins. How do I get this thing to move? How do I go down to make it? Oh, here, there's a little button. Okay, I found it right here. There. No. How do I make it go? Oh, there it is. All right. Okay, we're good, Jamie. Thanks. So this is from a book by Marshall Solins. It was called How Natives Think, for example, about Captain Cook. So I'm kind of playing off of that because what I've found is a really intriguing way to get around the question of whether you're a believer or whether you're an experiencer or whether you're just being objective enough to be counted as a scholar, is if we think about the question as one of epistemology, as how we know things, how do we know things? This book, How Natives Think, for example, about Captain Cook, was a heated debate between Marshall Solins and Gananath Obeyesekera over the details of Captain James Cook's death in the Hawaiian Islands in 1779. And the main idea of this debate was to discuss and understand how to understand the rationality of indigenous peoples. How do we look as a Westerner at other people's point of views? And how do we count them? Are they irrational and uncivilized? Are they superstitious? Or do we measure it in terms of our own Western, rational, practical, utilitarian perspective on the world? And so for me, this was something that I kept coming up against, was this problem in anthropology, which is trying to, on the one hand, say, well, you know, we're completely into cultural relativism, and so we have to accept all these different cultures, and at the same time, we are using our own epistemology to make these other cultures conform to our standards of rationality, or we are allowing them to just be different as a kind of celebratory, and they do things there, the bongos do it different that way. And so I was trying to figure out how do I go about studying Buddhism as a question of how we know things. Now, Marshall Solins asserted, and he was a great person for me to intellectually bounce against, which was, he made this assertion that there is no immaculate perception. He said there is no immaculate perception. Let's see if I can get this going. So we're back at Michael. Well, there's no immaculate perception. The idea, I don't need to stand on Michael while I talk about perception. We'll get to Michael. The idea of there's no, there it is, no such thing as an immaculate perception. Marshall Solins believed that every single sensorial knowing co-rises with a conceptual realm that is always already containing the things that we can perceive. So in a sense, we can never get to any kind of sensorial perception. Perception is always something that is colored through conception. And I found this deeply troubling, having been a meditator, because the whole objective is to observe percepts and to disentangle them from concepts and to be able to recognize when a concept is a concept and when a percept is a percept. But we don't really have a language to describe or to discuss that. And so some of the things that I discovered was that there was a lot of prejudice, at Harvard especially, for how I would undertake a study of this kind. So I had first been to Burma. Well, before we get to Burma, let me talk about Michael. So here's our picture of Michael now. Why am I having so much trouble there? Well, there's Coco. So you know Coco. Here's Michael. Michael was the male gorilla. He was an adolescent who had a 10-foot arm span, and I spent 12 hours a day signing sign language with him. And I grew up with 13 chimpanzees. My father collected animals for a zoo in Africa at one point, and I had pygmy hippo and chimpanzees and Diana monkeys and hornbills, and we lived in a tree house for half a year. And so I had a lot of primate experience. I never knew it was going to come in handy. So when I had finished at Berkeley, I went looking for a job, and there was a job board. And when I went to look on the job board, there were all these people around the kind of hard science side of the room, not where anthropologists went. But after that crowd left, because there was so much murmuring, I went to see what all the talk was about. And there was a sign that said, "Teach sign language to a gorilla on the Coco Project." And I thought, this is fantastic. You know, I know about apes. So but I didn't know sign language. So I memorized 500 signs over the weekend. And then I went in for an interview. And the woman before me was a natural signer. And she went in, and when she saw the gorilla, the first thing she did was open her eyes wide, which is a sign of aggression. When you do that, human whites, that's a big sign of aggression. So Michael said, "Damn, damn, damn," he slammed. And so her interview didn't go so well. She was out. And then it was my turn. And so I just acted like a submissive female gorilla. And he rolled over and said, "Tickle me," so I got the job. So communication. I became very interested in the question that Wittgenstein posed, which is, are the limitations of your language the limitations of your world? And this question, you know, Michael signed 250 words. Coco at that time was signing 500 words. She could read 12 words. We were looking at a project in which the scientific constraints set out by Hackett, who had said there are 13 conditions of language that make human beings different than all other animals, and that language is what makes human beings different. Well, the gorillas ended up being able to do all of those 13 things. And so suddenly this idea about why are we so special as a species, and why are we even asking the question that way, suddenly these things became really troubling, and so troubling that in fact some Jesuits came and wanted to baptize the gorillas because they felt they had a soul. But I think that these are important kinds of considerations. We're trying to figure out, how do we engage with sentient beings? What does it mean to communicate? How do we communicate not only between species, but how do we communicate in our environment? And I'll come to the question of environment later. Oops, wow, I'm really having trouble with this. Now, stay. Is there any way to just kind of move it?
Can't you just click the mouse button?
Well, it doesn't seem to, well, we'll try. So, whoops. Yeah, I would like to just kind of roll it, but I can't. Sorry, Jamie to the rescue.
You just go like this? See?
Oh, okay, how do I back it up?
That I don't know. Previous, right?
All right, we'll go up there.
But I
Let's
think you
try
just
that.
click the left. Oh, that's right, you're a Mac user. You don't know what left.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Again, another form of communication, but
Try using the arrow buttons left and right so you've got on your laptop.
oh, but they're not connected. These aren't connected. I'm just reading my notes here, and this is. Oh, you've got something there.
There's a keyboard.
Ah, perfect. Thank you. This is good. All right. So, why did I put the Scala Natura here? Well, let's talk about the Scala Natura. What I realized is that part of our way of engaging the world as a rational, Cartesian, objectifying, subject-object kind of cosmology, like the Scala Natura, where we have God at the top of this hierarchy, and in fact in some of the early anthropology, The idea was that there was God, angels, Victorian gentlemen, then all the way it went down until you got to the Aborigines. So this idea of how do we look at difference among human beings, different societies, in terms of how civilized or primitive they are, this idea, the Skala Natur, was being developed there too. And so we have this kind of reverberation of our cultural models, of our cosmologies, that have a real kind of staying power. And this model, which sees us as inheriting nature, so the human being in relationship to nature that it can exploit and use, we can use it for all of our advantage. This model is something that kept striking me as being a very strong cosmology, one that we keep seeing places us in a kind of epistemological bind, a kind of way of knowing things in a particular way. Compare, say, to this 31 planes of existence, which many of you are probably familiar with, where each of these realms are based on the kinds of consciousness that you've conditioned. Now I'm trying to think how an explanation of violence or exploitation, how they look different if you come from these different cosmological models. It doesn't mean that violence doesn't exist in either of these places, or that you don't have exploitation, but what you have is a different idea about where personhood is, about what the relationship is to others, what the obligation is. Morality starts looking a little different, especially between species and between what it is that's considered the self and what should be inside and what is outside. Animals are outside. In fact, even these days, there are studies of the gut, which is supposed to be, the newest studies say that the gut is more complex than the human brain. And yet we've treated it like, well, the gut, we have to get all those germs and bugs and everything out of there because animals belong out there, not in here. If you take the Buddhist idea of the fathom-long body, we maybe have to think about our environment differently. We have to think about codependence or interdependence in a different way. And so this idea of how we separate, how we classify in the Cartesian way, seems to me to have all kinds of implications for how we make our world. This is Lady Sayadaw. And Lady Sayadaw was a monk during the colonial period in Burma who encouraged farmers, especially farmers, to practice meditation because he felt the end of the world was coming near. It was a messianic idea. He felt that with colonialism, we were seeing the end of sasana, or the end of Buddhism, the end of the Buddha's teachings. And so the thing that he felt was necessary was that he would teach people the techniques that would allow everyday people to attain nibbana so that they would be saved in this world cycle. So one of the things he said was that you should practice as though your head is on fire because the end of the world is near. Now, it was an interesting kind of anti-colonial movement, and it had real implications with U Nu. U Nu was the first prime minister of Burma. He was a friend of mine, and my daughter's named after him, Nunu. And U Nu felt that what he was going to do was create an enlightened democratic society. But he was going to do it through meditation. He was going to decolonize Burma, bring back the sasana, the glory of the sasana. And he was going to do it not by teaching books or something that was just he was going to do it by actually getting people to experience Dhamma, to actually become enlightened. So what he did was he required, when he was prime minister, that one person from every single village had to come to Mahasi Yekta Monastery and meditate. And then they would go back and they would teach people in their village. And this was going to be a way of getting people to experience things directly. Now, he also made other proclamations, such as if you're a criminal, there was a huge project to teach meditation inside the prisons. And if you were a criminal and you attained to enlightenment, well, you'd be set free because you'd never break your precepts. So the idea of thinking about how to create a society in which you were going to have an enlightened society was his project. And it had real impact because he really helped to develop the meditation technique and the institutions that could hold it, but also missionizing efforts. This right here is a picture of Ben Gurion, who came and meditated in Unu's home for 3 months with him. And this was during the time when he was trying to figure out, well, how do we think about making a Jewish state? So the idea of the nation state being built in the context of trying to find a meaningful philosophical and religious foundation was something that Unu felt, well, why don't you meditate and explore what the foundations of your knowing are so that you can build the right kind of society. So these were kind of an interesting little side note. But we see that the impact of meditation really moved very quickly through the efforts of the government of Burma and through Mahasi Sayadaw, who systematized the meditation practice. In fact, it's kind of interesting. He systematized it in a way that we might say was very rational, bureaucratic, in the sense of having borrowed from the British. He had all of his students that he had trained. He would have them take notes of the experiences of their yogis. And then he correlated all of these experiences and looked at them to see what they were experiencing, if he could identify what the consensus of a kind of experience was. And he created this idea of 12 steps, or 12 nyanzin, 12 stages of insight. This is not from the text, but he tried to also corroborate it with things from Buddhaghosa, the Visuddhimagga, to be able to show that it was consistent with the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. So his commentary, his scholarly commentary, is actually written out in marble in a mausoleum that's on Mahasi Yekta, so that will last for all time. So this idea of 12 stages of insight, very systematic experience of moving through the stages of enlightenment, was undertaken with so much fervor during the 1960s and 70s. At that time in Burma, meditation was actually the largest export for Burma. The gross national product was coming in through meditation. And just the monastery where I stayed, there were over 1 million people who claimed to either have experienced nyanzin, one of the stages toward enlightenment, or to have attained enlightenment itself. Now, the question about who is and who isn't, I mean, if you are, you don't claim it. But of course, at the monastery, there's always all kinds of rumors, so the ladies would say things like, have you got your insurance policy yet? So that you don't go down into the hell realms. You've gotten to you've become a first stage sotapan, you've crossed the river, so you won't. Or they would, they had all these kinds of euphemisms. But for me, the difficulty in trying to study this was, well, how do I study 100 people in a room sitting silently? And my advisors at Harvard said, oh, you can't study that. I mean, you can't know what they're experiencing. And I said, well, that's true. And if you ask them, all they have is narratives, and narratives are already so far away from the experience of meditation. It's already gone through the kind of cultural, lens. They would just be narratives that would be interesting, but I wasn't feeling like I would really get to what was really happening with meditation. So what I decided to do was to study the pedagogy. So I would watch how the monks taught people, because there was a sincere, they weren't trying to prove to you, we've got enlightenment, here's my story, but rather it was in the everyday working out of people's experiences after they'd been sitting, and the monk telling them how to balance their mental faculties so that we could see how they were involved in a project and directing their yogis toward a certain kind of experience, and what didn't count for an experience, and how they acted against skepticism, how they countered skepticism, or so all these things allowed me to sort of treat a more sincere account of how people were approaching this. Now, from there I decided, well, since I'm not allowed to study the thing, and in fact, one of my professors said, oh, their experiences are just psychotic breaks. So we've either pathologized people's experiences, or we say that we can't study them at all, it's a forbidden science, because whatever's inside that black box of meditation, it's off the table because we are an objective science. Well, then what happens to epistemology? What happens to our way of knowing things if we're not even willing to investigate other ways of knowing? Whether they're talking to gorillas, and with regard to the gorillas, I had one person at Harvard say, oh, so you're a believer. As though the question was about belief or not, black or white. And I said, no, it's not about belief. I said, in fact, throw away all the stories I just told you, and tomorrow they'll still be signing. It's a dialogue, it's a discourse, it's ongoing. The question is, what is going to break your cultural categories or create enough kind of crisis in your knowing that you may be open for a moment to thinking that we may know the world in a new way, that we may know things differently, and what might that knowing be? And also, what kind of crisis would be required for us to actually not reinterpret it? We've got ecological, crisis in terms of global warming. Well, don't worry, I'm not worried about it. We'll just figure out something technical to fix that in the future. How many times have I heard people say that? It's like, what about a small is beautiful model where instead what we're doing is we're being more content with having little rather than this ridiculous, unsustainable, constant pursuit of an idea about personhood, which is that we are creatures of unlimited desire and unlimited wants. U Pandita, my teacher, once said to me, two great things, I'll have to share both. First was, how come these foreigners, can't they do anything else with their mind instead of thinking? And it was such a great kind of naive question because he was so surprised that, well, thinking, which is just one kind of thing you can do, there's so many others, but they only did thinking. Can you imagine? The other was, he said, this puzzle, he said, having everything or not wanting anything, which is better? So having everything or not wanting anything. I think that's kind of the problem, because we've all sort of slipped into a identity kind of crisis in which we only know ourselves through our consumption patterns. And we've really lost touch with the sensate world, with the sensorial world, such that we are so separated. We no longer hear. We no longer hear our environment. We no longer strive to listen to other animals or to the way that nature is, and to notice that we are this fathom-long, interconnected body. So some quick pictures. This is at Mahasi. Women tended to be the better meditators than men. Men said that was because women had childbirth and things like that, and so they knew how to deal with pain. And also they listened to the monks, and they weren't skeptical, but the bottom line was that women are better meditators. But here you see men and women and monks, 3 categories of gender, men, women, and monks, and they are a 3rd category of gender. Tilashin nuns are not a 3rd category because they're not considered actually part of the Sangha, because the ordination went out in Theravada, they say 500 years after the Buddha passed away. And here we are now in the United States. So I wanted to reflect a little bit. Why, do you know anybody here? No, I'm just curious. So I wanted to reflect a little bit about how meditation makes our world, because I've watched since 1982 as meditation has really come to take root in America, and how it's changed in the way that it's come here. First, the 4 foundations of mindfulness you're all aware of, so I won't even spend too much time, but I thought if this were an unknowing crowd that I would put it there. But so the first way that meditation, mindfulness meditation, really got a hold was through therapies, through dealing with pain therapy, relaxation, stress, hospice care, death and dying. these were the ways that meditation could be applied in a utilitarian sense. It works, therefore, we can see that there must be something to it. Again, we're still not accepting what might be going on inside of that process of meditating, but it does seem to have results. So this was the mindfulness-based cognitive therapies, these kinds of approaches which are, I always say, trying to make a non-existent self better, but, you know, it's kind of, and also in the way that we do things, we need to objectify what's going on. No, we're looking for happiness, and I think it's in the amygdala. You know, it's like this whole kind of representation of the brain such that you lose the actual sense of the direct experience that it's trying to refer to. So we're all looking at the finger and we're not really noting what it's supposed to be suggesting we might do differently with our mind. Some more of these fMRI. And I love this, you know, this idea of the pursuit of happiness through fMRIs. I spent last year in Bhutan before I got medevaced, so my research was cut short. But in Bhutan, there, of course, you've heard of the gross national happiness, and they're trying to find a way to fight against these development models which are based on GDP, and instead replace it with a kind of Buddhist idea of being content with little. And it's kind of heart-wrenching to see some of the unknowing ways in which people are allowing things like advertising to come in, which I think advertising is completely anathema to Buddhism because it's only there to excite greed, you know, it isn't something that is actually helping you to calm the mind down. It fascinated me that the idea of happiness, once it had been sort of codified that way, GDP, you know, G and H, that people could start listening to it. It became one of the 9th millennial pillars for the UN recently. So people are pursuing this, but they really don't know what the hell it means because they can't really. So this is supposed to get to it, I think. We'll use meditators to get to it. Education, there's a jazz mindfulness program. I looked on that, that's pretty cool, I thought. But anyhow, children, it's also snuck into schools as one of those, it's one of those mindful things that because it's secular and it's not having to do with religion, of course. And now Christians are saying, well, wait a second, how come, wait a second, hold on. You know, this isn't just secular, you can't bring, what? So I think that there's some questions about what kind of Trojan horse mindfulness is when it's just treated as something utilitarian. But again, we're treating mindfulness as something we can do with it. What is it, this tool, that we can do things with? Business and corporations. Yeah, let's have a retreat and figure out how to make more money. People have recognized that when you look at perception, when you disconnect from all that reactivity, that there's some clarity that develops, that you can bring your heart rate down, your blood pressure down, that you can clear your mind and make a good deal. I mean, I don't know, it seems like we're coming to it all wrong. We're coming to it like Scala Natura, one more thing to use as a bludgeon against the world. And even the Zen room of Apple, Steve Jobs, thank you, glitch there, Steve Jobs. I love this, you have to read this. I thought that was so cute. All right, so geek meditation session. Yeah, and so that we can think different. Again, we're thinking different so that we can do things with our different that's going to, what? Bring us peace, bring us happiness, bring us money. I think that we are doing something wrong with the way that we're approaching what's happening with this meditation. The military, they're also big users of meditation, mindfulness meditation, not only to be out there in the field and do the job you need to do without feeling too bad about it but also to heal afterwards. There's a very kind of strange way of treating how the mind should be conditioned. And again, I think that there's something that is utilitarian and kind of missing the point. For those of you who are Goenka students, you are familiar with this, doing Vipassana with the Baden Kira, is that Kira? Is that her name? She had all of these. Kiran Bedi, thank you. And these are the guards who are meditating before first they had the guards meditate, and then they had the prisoners meditate, and then they were completely, they found a new compassionate kind of relationship. So much so that men in here who were there for life for having killed people, they reached out to the sisters of these men that they had murdered, and the sisters were so moved by these men's sincerity in recognizing what they had done that they adopted them as their brothers. So it's a very kind of amazing idea about how we transform our relationships. And I think that that's the thing that's so important. How does it help to transform relationships? And now it's being done here in the United States, Dharma Brothers, Alabama Department of Corrections. Why, everybody's doing meditation. Now you guys have to listen to this. We have to be quiet so that we can hear this. I hope you can get this. I'm not kidding. Okay, yeah, so everybody's meditating, including your pets should meditate. Again, once it's good for you, what's good for you is good for the dog. Time magazine has been showing what a revolution, or as Tricycle said, to be blonde, white, and mindful. Yeah, it seems like it's just another one of those things we're wearing this year. And then, of course, we were all probably very moved by the monks' protests in 2007. So I wanted to take you on a little bit of an interpretive journey, because when the monks started protesting, nobody expected that they were going to be suddenly, it was like a flash revolution. And I got called by the State Department to come in and discuss with them what was happening and to debrief the ambassador, because they didn't know how to make sense of this. What I tried to explain was that it was not about Aung San Suu Kyi. Everybody thought, oh, this is about democracy. Now, there were some monks who were saying, let's free Aung San Suu Kyi, but that wasn't why the tens of thousands of monks actually, and this is, once again, yeah. It's just our point of view, what can I say? But anyhow, the monks turned the bowl over, which is a kind of monk strike. And the idea is that they will no longer accept alms from the military regime. And the idea here is not only symbolic, which is how people treated it in the international press. It's not symbolic, it's actually doing something karmically. What you're doing is you're removing the conditions by which a ruler can be powerful, because they need to have merits in order to sustain their place as a ruler. So when you remove their merits by saying, we'll no longer accept your alms, this is the ultimate sanction, but it's also, it's going to not only say, I think you're illegitimate, it's also making them illegitimate. It's taking away their power. So this was what the monks were really protesting about, the reason being that when they started protesting in earnest, they went for a number of days. The New York Times, actually, a reporter contacted me, and he said, I'm writing an article, it's called Burma's Militant Monks. I just want a few lines from you. And I said, well, you're not going to get a few lines from me, because if you call it Burma's Militant Monks, then you're irresponsibly making them people who are going to be attacked by the government. He said, what do you? I said, you have a responsibility. The New York Times is going, if you print something like that, you'll bring the entire demonstration to an end, because then the government in Burma can say, see, they're bogus monks, because no monk can be involved in politics. And if you say that they're militant, then they can get the sanction from the outside world saying, see, even the New York Times says they're militant and political, so therefore, of course we're just getting rid of bogus monks. Well, thankfully, he listened to me, and the protest went on for a whole number of days later until democracy activists got involved in trying to take the crowds and step in front of the parade, and the monks would say, no, don't get involved. And when the activists tried to take the crowd this way, the monks would try to take them that way, because they were trying to keep this a non-political act. This was not a political act. This was a monk's right to say, we will not accept your alms because you have not treated the sasana correctly. So what sparked it was that there were monks who were protesting in Pakoko, and the local authorities there tied the monks to a pole, they beat them, one went missing, one was killed. And this was the reason why they asked for an apology from the regime, and the regime refused to give an apology. Now, what's required when you do say I'm sorry to the Sangha is you have to wash your head in public, and you have to apologize and say that you are going to, you're going to reform yourself and to support sasana in the proper way. Well, they didn't do that, and so the monks went on this march with tens of thousands of monks in many, many cities. This is Aung San Suu Kyi, who came out of her gate for one moment. In fact, on the morning that it happened, I learned from someone at a monastery who was a supporter of Aung San Suu Kyi, who went to the head of the small district area to ask the military person if the monks could walk by her house. And they agreed. Now, this is just an individual. What I'm trying to explain is that each individual within the military, they don't always act just like one face. This individual wanted to support Aung San Suu Kyi, wanted to support the monks who were now saying this regime is illegitimate. And so when the monks came by, what they did, what they were saying to her was, we think that you are the next pretender to the throne. You are the next legitimate ruler. We sanction you as the ruler. This is a picture of Than Shwe, a painting that was done. Than Shwe, General Than Shwe, is also known as monk killer Than Shwe, who cracked down on the monks during this time, and who held power and is still alleged to hold power. Here he is dressed in the garb of a Burmese king. All Burma's politics can be understood in terms of Sangha-state relations of kingship. Kingship is always at the back of politics in Burma. And these statues he had built, they're all of famous kings from Burma, and he believes, that middle one, Chansitu, he believes that he is the reincarnation of that king from the 1700s. And that king was a mighty man of endeavor. Mighty man of endeavor is a kind of heroic, kind of a wizard-like character who has all of these supernatural powers. And it was Than Shwe's wish that he should gain these supernatural powers. Now, here's how I'm telling you the story of how he gained these supernatural powers. There's a little bit of a timeline here. So we had the monks' protests. The monks were cracked down on. People were stunned in Burma. They couldn't believe that the government would draw the blood of a monk. This is the worst kind of offense, and it completely delegitimizes the regime. You can still hold power. That doesn't mean you have legitimacy. You can still have force, but that's not legitimacy. You have to have that given by the people, and they were no longer giving it. So what ended up happening was, 4 months later, Tamanya Sayadaw, who was a famous monk who resisted the regime, and here he's pictured with Aung San Suu Kyi, he was famous for not accepting the alms of the regime. So the regime would try to give him alms and he refused them, like turning over the bowl. In fact, when I went to see him soon after, he got a diabetic coma and he had to be flown to the hospital in Rangoon. And while he was in a coma, all of the military ministers came and offered him donations in order to make use of him as a merit field. They did this in private. This is why it's not something, this is why I say it's a sincere wish to gain some kind of power. Anyhow, Tamanya Sayadaw died during this time. His body was put in state, and he was under glass so that pilgrims could keep coming to see him. And then one day, 14 military men came in, smashed the glass, and stole the body. And a month later, Nargis happened. Now, all of these things are part of a supernatural interpretation, because in Burma, legitimacy is also demonstrated by the weather. In fact, so much so that the newspapers say every day, the weather will be fair throughout the land. That's the weather report, because the regime is showing that it's legitimate, it's not got bad weather. So when Nargis hit and all of these people were homeless and hundreds of thousands of people killed, the feeling was that this was retribution to Burma, because king and country go together, that this was retribution for having a bad king. Now here's a funny cartoon. This is a cartoon, I like to have it because it is an image that lets you know what was going on in the gossip inside Burma. So this got done into an English cartoon. But here, what it is talking about is how the body that was stolen was actually cannibalized. This is what people think, not just they're joking, they think that he cannibalized Tamanya Sayadaw in order to become a mighty man of endeavor at this moment of crisis where he no longer had control over the government. He was going to practice what's the black arts, yadya, the shadow side of Buddhism, taking advantage of all those kind of cause and effect karmic involvements. You're going to use that in order to sustain your power, even though it's eventually going to drain out and you're going to lose all your power. So he apparently went missing in the middle of this whole crisis because he ate this body and thought he could fly. This is what people close to him said, and he tried to jump off a chair and fly, and he hurt himself. So people were making great fun of him. So this is a picture of that was done by Burmese, showing his guilt, his karmic responsibility for Nargis, because he had killed the monks. That these were all causally connected. So what did he do? He built a pagoda to try and amend. It's kind of like that karmic debt thing, you're constantly trying to see what you can do to even out your balances. So he built this pagoda, and here's his wife Chai Chai throwing money up as auspicious in the opening. And here he is praying devoutly with his second in command. And here is the cartoons showing what he's trying to have those sins cover. Here's another example, the white elephant. He's been collecting white elephants all through the 90s, because white elephants also, as you know, are a sign of legitimacy for kings. Only kings have white elephants. And then there's the question of whether it was really white or kind of gray or dusty brown. So these were the debates. What's interesting about those debates is that people are engaging on the level of the elephant about whether it really is a sign of his legitimacy. Because in Burma, one of the things that's important to recognize is that people can say, yeah, he's really legitimate, damn. He's a bad king, and sometimes you get bad kings, but they're legitimate, but there are kings, and we deserve it because it's our karma. So it's a very kind of complicated logic. It's not about like human rights or our ideas about politics in which we say bad kings are illegitimate kings, so therefore it's not like that. Here's an interesting little example here. Dan Shui, you can see the statue above him, done in his image. He made this image of a Buddha and he put it at Shwedagon Pagoda. And then he had the UN Ban Ki-moon come and pay respects to it. And Gambhiri, also the representative from the UN, who is a Muslim, did not bow to it, but stood there looking at it. But the point here is that he was doing magic again, yedya. What he wanted to do was, by having Ban Ki-moon bow down to the effigy of him, he was actually making his power overcome the UN. And the other thing that he did, we found out from people in the military who were close to Tang Shui, was that when the UN advisors would come and stay in a hotel, inside of the ceiling, they would put women's underpanties, because it's believed that women are polluted and that it takes away a man's power, his pon. So they were taking away the power of all these UN advisors. And so I love this campaign, Panty Power, that came up. And why I show this picture is that I think it's a really fascinating response during the whole period when the monks were protesting. This campaign came out, it became an international campaign. Women were at Burmese embassies flinging their panties over the gates and sending them in boxes with no return, names. And the idea being that we were actually having an intersection of two cosmologies, two ways of knowing the world, and we were using it for a political purpose. And it's not like the arrows are just going one direction, indigenous societies, uncivilized places going to civilization. It's moving in both directions, and we have to understand what kind of new ways of knowing are emergent. So now the last thing I wanted to draw attention to here is, this was the Asian Time magazine. This was U Wirathu, who in 2013 is said to be responsible for exciting Muslim-Buddhist violence. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the ongoing Rohingya problem and Muslim violence inside Burma. And what's interesting in the press is that all of the press writes, oh my God, Buddhists being violent? It's like a man bites dog story. Everyone is in shock. But I think that the interpretation of what's going on is not correct. The idea that, this one, that now it's Buddhism's turn to be violent. I think that we have, from a Western point of view, Western epistemology tries to place our best ideals onto societies to say, oh, see, they have like human rights. Buddhism is basically international universal human rights. And to say that it's sort of like a kind of epistemological colonization is like saying, our things. But in fact, they're not the same thing at all. And we're seeing that right now in Burma, where the president of the country, who's saying that he's going to support Buddhism and Sasana and protecting Sasana land, the sacred geography, he's more popular than Aung San Suu Kyi. So what is our idea about democracy? Maybe we're missing what the real discourse is, what it means to spare Sasana. And I think that what we're really looking at is we're looking at the fear that a Western, Cartesian, utilitarian point of view on the world is actually going to take the life force out of their life world. When you look at the public sphere and you say, no, this can't be a Buddhist public sphere anymore. Everybody gets to participate in the public sphere. There's going to be Muslims, there's going to be... And the Buddhists say, well, wait a second. No, what makes this so special here in Burma is that we have a Sasana land. I was thinking about this as I was doing this talk, putting it together, and I was thinking about how I was here when Tangpulu Sayadaw, the famous forest monk from Burma, came to Boulder Creek in California, and he established a pagoda. And this is really important for Burmese, is to create a sima, the sima where monks can be ordained inside. This is the only sacred land that kings cannot own. This is owned by all the peoples of the world. And when they made this, one of the things that the kapia, the lay attendant, kept coming up to me and asking, do you have like spirits, or what are the spirits around here? And I'm like, huh, what? Well, what spirits do you have like in California? Like what? And because I didn't really know what he was talking about, eventually a number of us said, oh, we have Sasquatch here, or we have Yeti. We have, well, it turns out Yeti, the Nepali word for what is yaka, the demons. So, in fact, this resonated with him. Oh, what's it called? Bigfoot. Okay, so the next day when we're having the ceremony, we get up early in the morning, and there are all these huge foot marks all around the pagoda. And it turns out he had fashioned out of wood his idea of what a Yeti or what a Bigfoot might look like, because you needed to consecrate this here in the land by having demons and people who would be looking after it. That the supernatural and the natural and the human, all of these realms collapse into one unity. And there's something about that relationship that we have lost sensual contact with. We've lost our relationship to knowing in that way. What's going to cause a kind of crisis for us to rethink or to open up to the possibility of knowing things differently, of trying a different way of seeing things? Maybe it will be ecology. Maybe it will be the fact that we're killing our planet very quickly. Maybe it's the way that we produce food for ourselves, where we treat animals as a bare life form, where we treat them, but we torture them, and we keep them in confined spaces, and we think nothing about treating them as things that can be genetically modified so that they grow so fast in 7 weeks that they can't even stand on their own feet. This kind of way of appropriating the world, this kind of scala natura way, this way of saying everything in nature is for us to use and to do something with, maybe that will force us, when we see that we're coming to the end of forests, that we'll have to take a new approach to knowing. And I like this comes from Thailand, and I wanted to end with this note, because I think it's a really interesting moment where monks are ordaining trees. Now, that's not a traditional practice, but it's a practice that fits in the cosmology and in the epistemology of Buddhists. Why? Because how can you be a forest monk without having a forest? And so the idea of making the tree an ordained member of your society is really understanding that they are a part of you and that they're a part of our world. And I think that maybe those are the crises that let us start beginning to open to a new kind of epistemological way to know the world. So thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a whole lot of fun. One of our is Sue here, Darlington? No? One of our colleagues who teaches at Hampshire College, her whole topic writes books about this thing. So there are a lot of things that were very resonant in that talk. Thank you so much. And I'm sure that Ingrid will entertain questions.
Yes?
How did Burma get from Ulu to the military dictatorship?
Okay, so the first thing that well, when Ne Win made a bloodless coup, there was an event that sort of sparked it. I mean, these things are cumulative, but the event that sparked it was that U said that he wanted Ne Win, who was his general, he was going to pass a law that said that you couldn't slaughter beef because it was not Buddhist. And Ne Win retorted that he was going to be even a better Buddhist than U because he was going to take on the karmic debt of allowing beef to be slaughtered for the sake of the people. So there was this kind of Buddhist argument about what it means to take care of the people. But when Ne Win took over and put U under house arrest, what he did was he decided to remove all of the Buddhist trappings from the government. And what I think has happened since Ne Win's period in 1962, through all the successive regimes since then, is been a process, sort of like a pendulum moving back and forth, of each regime trying to figure out how they can gain legitimacy without Buddhism. And every time they discover they can't, they keep getting pulled back in, that those are the terms on which people will give them legitimacy. And as we've watched during the 1990s under Kim Yunt, there was all this pagoda building and all kinds of merit making and all kinds of things that the government was undertaking on behalf of the people that gave them legitimacy. And one of the most important was restoring Shwedagon Pagoda and putting at the very top the umbrella, which is this hadn't been done since King Mindon, the famous king from the 19th century. And so when they were putting the tea on the umbrella, I asked a taxi driver to describe what that moment was like, and he said, we were all shaking, because if it's an illegitimate king, then we'll have earthquakes and storms, and it will be terrible in the environment. And so we all waited with our breaths holding what would happen. And Kinyon put the tea up, and nothing happened. And then we said, oh, alas, he's legitimate. So I think that what I've tried to show is the way in which these generals actually aren't capable of being able to say, look, we're just going to do it my way. The meditators especially keep pulling them back into a kind of moral legitimacy that is understood in terms of this continuum of purification practices that have to do with where you are on the path, where you are as a monk, and how you are performing as an individual the purification of mind and morality. Where did Jamie go? Oh, yes.
It's just about that last sentence, right? That this is about somehow the purification of an individual's mind rather than about the side of Buddhism that is, ritualistic and ceremonial, and some of these other ways that we would say it needs to be Buddhist. It's legitimacy for who it needs to be Buddhist, but why make a moral move rather than other ways of being Buddhist that isn't about that internal moral state?
I think that when you see what is the core for what a Burmese Buddhist would say is the person worth the highest respect, they would say a monk, but usually they would say a monk who is considered to be an arhat, so someone who's enlightened. So that person has a lot of, any monk draws around him, if he's a really pure monk, especially if he is a monk who's considered an arhat, he draws around him all kinds of patrons. The patrons are there because they want to take advantage of his merit field. What the regime has done is that they have recognized that they need to control all these merit fields in order to maintain power. And so there was a reorganization of the entire civil service during the 1990s, where it was left over from the British as a kind of secular bureaucratic system. What ended up happening was that each of the offices and ministries got organized around an individual attached to a monk, because the monk and they were all like little kings. And so each ministry had their own damayon or meditation hall that was right next to the pagoda. So each ministry, and the forestry department, one of the examples that I really loved during the 90s, the forestry minister asked someone in another ministry if he could personally borrow $4 million so that he could build an escalator up Shwedagon to get to the platform so that old people could go and pay respects to the pagoda, and he would be making merits off of this great work. And this kind of, he made so much money off of the little jots that were spent that he could eventually pay the loan off. But these were personal loans between individuals who were making merits within a system of patron-client relationships. And so when we look at their government and we say, oh, look, there's the president, there's the civil, that's just a facade, because behind it are all the patron-client relations and the structural relationships. In fact, the military, which at one point, because of their involvement, they also have a lot of their involvement with violence, and that they have a lot of nat worshipping, so worship of the spirits, so that they can get special favors. The military is actually famous for doing yariya, black magic, and all the dark arts in order to keep their power up. And the government felt that these were becoming cliques that might become cross power systems that would threaten their own power. So they separated nat practice from Buddhism and created nats in a special building in the ministry far away, and banned the military from being able to identify around these nat cults. And then what they did instead was they replaced it with monk and Buddhist cults. So they never can escape Buddhism. They're all tied in together. It's a complicated system for, yeah.
So you said that basically these nyansens, the 12 stages of insight.
Oh, Nyanzen,
Society came up with there's kind of traces of that in the earlier text, but there's still kind of this very like empirical, scientific.
Right.
Kind of, almost like statistical
Right.
methodology, which I find interesting and stuff. As someone who got in contact with meditation through like here in America, I have been practicing for I've been meditating for like a couple of years and never heard about these like
The Nyanzen?
darker stages. So
Well, you can pick up Mahasi's Stages of Insight, and you'll see those stages if you're interested to look at it.
do you think it's there's something amiss about what like not talking about that and just painting meditation as this very like positive thing without like
Is it necessary to have Nyanzen, you mean?
yeah.
Well, in the Burmese system, the idea is that Nyanzen is identified so that you can understand that there is a kind of process, a psychological process that's taking place. And it's kind of like there's in the observing, the way that you're observing, underneath there's a kind of grammar that's flowing. And it's transforming the individual epistemologically. So that when you become enlightened, you can no longer have a point of view that would actually allow you to break a precept. I mean, from the Buddhist Burmese perspective, it would be impossible to break a precept because your knowing and being, your ontology and your epistemology, is so connected that you've actually been transformed. So how that process takes place has been systematically broken down by the Sayadaws as something that we can see the grammar. And that's why they put so much focus on, all right, when you're describing what you see, are you observing the rising or the disappearing? Or are you watching the whole process? And how long can you stay a sustained attention? And do you need to put more effort in? Or is your effort too great and you go past the object? Or do you have to focus on bring awareness more to it? All of these small fine-tunings so that people's attention can be micro-focused. And once that focus is there, things start to happen automatically. And it's that automatic process is the process of transformation. Yeah. Okay. Well, it was very nice. Thank you.
Anybody else, any students have any other questions? I'd like to hear from students.
Yes?
I guess it's relevant. But I was wondering when you mentioned the 31 realms of existence, if it could almost be adapted to understanding it in the sense that like a hell realm might just be someone who's like deeply afflicted by greed and hatred, so that in that sense, like I know the example of the hungry ghosts who are constantly trying to consume, and if that would almost sort of be a way of explaining modern day like hungry ghosts, people that constantly consume. And so in that sense, rather than being like an abstract heaven or hell, it's more of a mind state that one assumes.
So it sounds like what you're talking about is this really just a symbolic representation of our inner mental states?
Yeah, I guess symbolic, but less so in the sense that it really becomes your world once you are like a hungry ghost. You really do just live in this world of consuming and like of anger and hatred and greed, delusion, and all
Right. And that you make the body that goes with that.
Yeah.
So this mind and matter working together, not being separate. So that even in the arupa realms, the ones where there's no bodily form, is part of having conditioned the mental states such that it doesn't call materiality because it's too gross. So the idea is not just symbolic representation. It's not a kind of moral symbolic representation. It's actually a kind of ontology that comes out of epistemology. It's a way of being that comes out of knowing, that we make our being through knowing. It's cause and effect working together. Yeah. Does that answer it? Yeah. Yes?
So, and what role are the nuns playing in all of these actions where they're calling into question legitimacy of the rulers, where they're actually taking their power away, like turning over vehicles?
There were plenty of nuns who went to prison. There were plenty who are still in prison from that time. Interestingly, in Burma, where they don't believe that that women are part of the Sangha, you have actually got the most developed nuns order. And in fact, every year they tend to win the highest pariyatti examinations, scriptural examinations. And they're also renowned for being great meditators. But because they are only 10 precept holders, they have certain kinds of limitations on their purity, on their ability to, if the idea in Burma is that 227 rules, that this affords you a kind of purity that's greater than what a 10 preceptor would hold. These are the differences. But in terms of, in the monasteries, women get less food, they have to do most of the work, and I sent my daughter to study with the monk that I'd studied with 30 years later, that I had meditated with, and she was 17. She just graduated high school early, and she got very malnourished. When there was food to go, it went to the monks first. When there were vitamins to go, they went to the monks first. And especially during this period now where the regime has been trying to close off the monastery, to cut off the support in order to delegitimize the Sangha. There are not a lot of people who've been giving donations. And so there's a kind of complex thing in Mandalay, for example, Mandalay and Sagaing, which are the great meditation and scholarly centers for Sanghas. Mandalay has become like a kind of Chinese city now. All of the Burmese have been pushed out, and the monks don't have donors. And so what we have is a kind of crisis in our cities that isn't recognized by most viewers of, well, why is there so much objection to foreigners, to especially Muslims? But so people in Burma right now feel that sasana is under threat, especially the world has come in, and they're seeing that their ability to support feeding monks, feeding nuns, all of that is disappearing. And so that's part of the crisis that's emerged. Yeah.
Can you talk about your views about how to understand the Rohingya and the violence that's being directed at Muslims with contacts?
The interesting thing about monks like Uwirathu is that if you watch his speech, he's actually spoken against violence. What he's spoken for is that Buddhist communities should be supported, as against supporting Muslim communities. Now, for us, we have a very different idea about what the landscape of equal communitarian, space. But in a Buddhist context in Burma, the idea is that Burma is one of the last places where you have sasana land. And that means that every morning you should wake up and hear the Buddhist bell being rung, and you should see the monks going on alms rounds. And this is not a cosmopolitan metropolis that they want to see there. And there's very much fear that the opening of the country is going to be the decline of sasana. It has always been there. It's part of also why they've held on to these authoritarian rulers, because they felt that at least they'll protect sasana. There are all kinds of violence that Buddhists and sometimes Buddhist monks are actually perpetrating in these collective violences. But the issue for the Rohingyas has been that since colonialism, they've been pushing people in from Bangladesh, and there has been all kinds of waves of migration, especially during the corrupt military period, in which they are exchanging white cards, citizen cards, for money. And there's a lot of resentment in Arakan state. And so there becomes a lot of discourse about, were you originally here or not? And this is really dealing with some of these issues of immigration that have been ongoing throughout the decades. Yeah. It's a very complicated issue. I think the important one to look at is how we understand what Buddhists think are at stake there. And I think that never comes out in the international press. But if you're interested, I just wrote an article, and you can find it online. It's a terrible title, and I beg the editor, it's called Breaking Bad in Burma. But it's called Breaking Bad in Burma. I mean, it's like, I said, don't do that. I said, the monks will feel insulted. But he said, I have editorial rights. So there it is. Yeah, and you can find that.
I have a link to that. You can send me a link to it. So if you don't know her email, you can find it, and I can send you it.
Okay. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
From kind of a different back to some of the things that you were asking about meditation. You know, in the last 10 years here, and then like particularly in the IMS community, not in the language community, in the IMS community, there's been a real, I guess I can't say resurgence, a real surge in interest in jhana practice.
Yeah.
And I've also heard a number of people recently out at IMS who, you know, hold Mahasi Sayadaw responsible for, you know, the dry meditation, dry insight tradition that has removed all of that kind of stuff. And so, you know, it's kind of interesting for me to watch that developing here in the United States and to listen to.
There's a lot of kind of spiritual competition that goes on, you know, of course, and also because Mahasi really did stress that you were trying to do the simplest thing, not get lost. Don't try and become, you know, don't try and develop all your supernatural powers, being able to walk through walls, being able to fly, being able to hear things. You know, that's extra. Just get on with the business of getting out of samsara. That was his main take. But in the practice, when you're working with different teachers, sometimes there are different techniques that are used along the way when you need to deepen your practice, especially as people are developing in their practice. So jhana is often taught often because a student may practice and suddenly some prior practice idea, they'll suddenly start seeing discs, and so then if they tell that to their teacher, the monk will then work with them with discs or with one of these kind of. So I think that metta came in especially because people felt that it helped them to forgive themselves. There's a lot of kind of self-hate and things that especially Americans seem to have in the practice. And so there was a lot of working with those mental states as a way of just kind of clearing the space. And those also got developed into jhanic pathways. So I think it's interesting. I think right now, when I saw U Pandita recently, and the young monks who are now the elders, we were young together, and they have recently been coming to me and saying, what did U Pandita teach you? They're trying to collect, because the monk doesn't just give it as one big, you know, he teaches it differently to each person. And so they're trying to figure out what U Pandita knew, what his teachings was, and how they could take all of that under one kind of pedagogical, you know, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, she came a long way this morning. I didn't realize Milwaukee was required you to get on the airplane at 6 in the morning. So thank you very much.